Welcome to the Cosmic Eye Show, where we explore spiritual ideas and books that help you live a better life. Hosted by spiritual teacher and author of If You Can Worry, You Can Meditate, Jason Napolitano.
All right, welcome to the Cosmic Eye Show. Thanks for joining us today. It is Sunday. This is episode 10. And Chris is here with me. Hi, Chris.
Hello. Good to see you, Jason.
That is Chris Sheridan, and he is the author of Spirit in the Sky. I am Jason Napolitano, and I am the author of If You Can Worry, You Can Meditate. My book's available on cosmiceye.org or on Amazon, and Chris's is available at chrissheridan.com or on Amazon as well. So today we are going to get into the second part of our Secret Teachings discussion. It's a Secret Teachings study, actually. We're breaking down chapters. This is the second part of 3, and this is the section entitled The Ancient Mysteries and Secret Societies, Part 2. That's in section Roman numeral 3, which is a little bit strange. And that's in the Readers Edition. It starts on page 53, what we're covering today. In the big version of the book, it's in the section that's labeled 25, Roman numeral 25, which, if you don't know Roman numerals, is XXV. And then it's subtitled Part 2. So this is the second portion. And as Chris and I were kind of discussing earlier, not on the show here, but between ourselves, this section seems to be an overview of really what's to come, the kind of most important things that are coming up in the Secret Teachings, and a lot of the universal ideas, I think, that Manly Hall wants to touch on. He's sort of introducing these in these first chapters to kind of give you a feel for what's coming.
Yes.
I'm not going to cover them too heavily in depth, as we talked about, but we are going to go over them. And as we go on in this study, we'll go deeper into the different sections. Today, of course, we're going to talk about Gnostics. We're going to talk about Serapis, and we're going to talk a little bit about the Odinic Mysteries. Mostly it's going to be about, that's the most, I would say that's the most important section. Would you agree in this?
It is, and it's familiar. It's more
chapter.
Familiar in, I think, a general sense than Serapis or
Odin
Mysteries. Although Odin is popular in in the mainstream Western mind, but Gnosticism, and there's Gnostic as a descriptor for gnosis and knowing, and then there's what some people call Gnostic, or Gnostic with a capital G, and that is a particular form of a tradition that has Abraxas and Demiurgus and those things. This is a distinction, because Gnostic can be a descriptor, but it can also be the thing itself.
Yeah, I know a lot of the scholars don't even use the word Gnostic any longer, because there's so many different branches and so many different competing ideas within these early church ideas. They still use it, I mean, in their book titles and so on, because people understand that. But I think when you read academic papers and in that sort of area, they don't really, they shy away from the term Gnostic any longer. The word, though, itself is a fantastic word, and we talked again about that earlier off the show. The word gnosis is an interesting one. It means to know in Greek, but it denotes a different type of understanding that I think today in the modern world we may not be as familiar with. So I wanted to touch on that a little bit. What's your understanding of the Greek word gnosis?
Well, it's always been, for me, knowing, but is knowing an intellectual exercise where you have a bit of information, that kind of knowing what time it is, knowing how far it is to Chicago, or is it knowing that it's something that you've done in your life, something you've incorporated and ensouled and put into your daily living practice, and then there's a kind of a wisdom knowing that's beyond just information knowledge. This is applied knowledge that, and I've realized something beyond just being told what this bit of info is.
That's a great way to put it. I love the word that you used, ensouled.
Well, that's from Manly Hall, because so.
I know, but I wanted to point that out.
Sure,
great reference. And I think it does. That conveys a sense of the word that I think, again, we don't understand today because we're so hung up on facts. It's easy for us to think that we know something in the sense of gnosis, when really all we know is a simple fact. We have some cognitive or rational understanding of something. That's not the same thing as gnosis. A gnosis is an ensoulment. It's an experiential knowing. It's a spiritual state of goes beyond the intellect. And I think it kind of touches back to when we were talking about duties of the heart, the Little Manly Hall work that we looked at in episode 7 or 8. But it's back there. It's called Duties of the Heart, and I would highly suggest the listener check that out if they haven't heard that one. But it connects the intellect and the heart together. This gnosis, it's something that goes beyond just the dry intellectual understanding. So I just wanted to touch on that a little bit because it's a bit of a different understanding than what I think we would consider quote unquote knowing today. What's interesting about this is he starts out the section, and I'm just going to quote him. He says, "The entire history of Christian and pagan Gnosticism is shrouded in the deepest mystery and obscurity, for which the Gnostics," he said, for a while the Gnostics were undoubtedly prolific writers, little of their literature has survived. The interesting thing is that he wrote this in the 20s when this book was first written, and that was before the findings at Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, which is where they found a lot of these quote-unquote Gnostic Gospels in 1945. They found 13 ancient books that contained over 50 texts. These are like Gospel of Philip, Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Judas, etc. And these are texts that really highlight the interesting and varied ways that Christianity was interpreted in its early days. And I think, we have an idea that, the Christian church is this or that because we understand the modern version of it, and maybe we've seen Joel Osteen or T.D. Jakes on TV, and so we think we have some understanding of Christianity. And, really we have to understand that that's just the outgrowth of the early ideas of orthodoxy, which in essence sort of smashed the ideas of the competing philosophies, of which there were many, and of which many were shaped by the Gnostic and pagan ideals of the ancient Near East, particularly Greece and Egypt. And so it's interesting to see that these documents that were found actually support what most of these early writers, 20s and even in the late 1800s, before they even had the documents in their hands to investigate. So there was a lot of speculation, but their speculation was actually moving in quite a clear path, and it was kind of right on the money. So it's very interesting. The other thing we wanted to talk about that we talked about earlier was this figure of Simon Magus, and I wanted you to kind of get into that a little bit because I think that that's a really interesting portion of this Gnostic sort of, I guess you'd want to call it, battle between Orthodox Christianity. So can you tell me a little bit about Simon Magus and your thoughts on that?
Well, sure. Simon the Magician, where we get the Magus from. In Manly Hall's text here, he talks about that Simon has been attributed with being the founder of Gnosticism. And that may be true. Of course, he was followed right after with Basilides.
I think it's Basilides. Yeah, that's how I've heard it. Yeah.
The Alexandrian, who actually, and just right afterwards, changed some things, added some things with Abraxas. And so you have to go so early, but it doesn't take that much time or space from, the source material for it to get adapted, adopted, altered, enhanced, maybe even completely rewritten. So it's great to keep going back to these original texts, which was, one of the great values of the Dead Sea Scrolls you were describing before, that here's and I think they were carbon dated to
Actually, Nag Hammadi, Dead Sea Scrolls were equally important find, but were different documents. But it was around the same time.
And
Nag
roughly
Hammadi
the
was
same area.
yeah, and similar writings, but more Old Testament stuff I think was found in at the Dead Sea Scrolls findings.
Okay, great distinction.
Sorry,
kind of glom those together, but
yeah.
Let's be clear. But I think with getting back to Simon, and there's an allegory, a story of Saint Peter and Simon Magus having a confrontation in Rome. Allegory, metaphor, whether it was real, so to speak, or not, but this is kind of, it exemplifies the conflict and really the complexity of what was happening around that time, and that we had there were a lot of pagan, very localized traditions that may not have spread forth across the Roman Empire, but they were definitely localized, and some of them did clump together. And with the advent of Christianity becoming more of the state religion of the Roman Empire, from right before that being persecuted, that it ended up being adopted, of course, through Constantine, and that's a whole additional story. But the conflict being between this new one is the one, the only one, and therefore all the other ones preceding or extant at the time are profane, they're vile, they're heretical, they're evil.
And you're speaking the other competing forms of Christianity at that time, or both. I mean, which ones are you specifically speaking of?
Well, probably both, because the early Christian church, it's every year there was probably a new offshoot or a new, because it was finding its footing, and some people believed, oh yes, you had to be, a Jew, confirmed Jew first, and then you could convert into Christianity, and other people believe, well, no, you can just go straight there, and among other, conflicts. But once there was appearing to be one official version, as represented through this St. Peter in the story. And basically there was a challenge between St. Peter and Simon Magus that, if he knew this, the forces and the spirits of nature and everything, that he could call on them, and then he would be lifted up into the heavens, and this seemed to happen. But then St. Peter struck back with that, oh no, all these are evil demons that are carrying you up, this multiplicity of earth spirits and everything, and that there is one true Christ energy, and therefore, you're false. And in the story, then all these supporting elements dissipated and disappeared, and as a result, then Simon fell back down to earth to his death. But it's really, of course, an allegory for the crumbling of all these other traditions that had built up. That
the different competing Gnostic and early Christian schools that were rivals in essence.
Yes, and that here is the one, quote,
here's the one true
way, but it's written by the people who conquered that.
Yeah.
So history is written by the winners, right?
Certainly.
So it really kind of showed what was going on. But the irony is that as Christianity became more of the official religion of the Roman Empire and that region, that as it did, it incorporated some of these traditions or aspects of these traditions that initially it was against. And that's a very logical thing, where the Roman Empire kept the local religious traditions and priesthoods and things as a way of, you maintain your thing, pay your taxes to Caesar, you can pray to your God. We're not going to get involved with that. So there was this sort of like acceptance, you do your thing as long as you obey Caesar. Whereas what happened later is all these little pieces were sort of converted and sometimes contorted to fit in with this new religion that was taking over, ostensibly to do the same thing, to allow the local people, oh, well, this is kind of familiar. That even if it was told in this new myth, it had some familiarity with what was before.
Exactly. And as time went on, they began to co-opt a lot of the gods and goddesses and mythological figures of the different peoples into Catholicism, in particular through the use of saints. And if you look at the bewildering variety of saints that there are today that are officially recognized by the church, you can kind of chain them back and see, the localities and so on where they came from, and you can see where the quote unquote pagan influences may have been co-opted into something that was officially recognized by the church and put a stamp of approval on. So those are some interesting ways that those energies and ideas still live on even today. The other thing that I find interesting is two ideas I have. One is, I told you about this previously. When I was in Rome, which was an amazing trip, I was at the Vatican and I was standing in the square, St. Peter's Square, in front of the in front of St. Peter's Basilica, and there's a large obelisk, which is it's like a tower, a long tower. The obelisk, what's the Washington Monument?
Yes,
is an obelisk, isn't it? Okay, so it's like a small version of the Washington Monument, but it has Greek symbols and so on. And on top of it, they have mounted a cross, and it's it's in comparison to the obelisk, it's actually the cross is actually kind of small compared to the obelisk itself. And I think what they meant by this was that they wanted it to say, okay, Christianity has supplanted the pagan religions and has overcome, and we have conquered. But what I got out of it when I was looking at it was more of, look at what we've built upon these great foundations of these early ancient traditions, and we're still carrying them forward today. And, they're still at work even in our modern day religion in one way or another. We just may not recognize it. That's my own interpretation, but I found it kind of an interesting thing. And the second thing that I was reminded of when you were talking about the co-opting of local gods and goddesses and so forth by the Romans is kind of the Catholic Church's policy these days in, say, Africa or in Brazil or in Haiti, wherever they may find themselves, where they're still quite popular. The Catholic Church is still rather powerful there. But at the same time, there's a lot of African influence. There's a lot of Afro-Caribbean religion still obviously alive today and still popular that runs within Catholicism and kind of in and around it. And the church was wildly opposed to it, 100 years ago. And their official policy is still that, but their actual practice today is, it's not, if it's not hurting anything and it's not contrary to any sort of Christian ideals, they kind of look the other way now. It's almost a don't ask, don't tell policy, which is very interesting. They're becoming a little more Roman in their outlook and a little less Catholic or, Orthodox universal. And I think that that's probably a good thing for the church.
Well, to survive, you have to adapt, and you can't be that far out of step with where the world is. Several hundred years ago, you could just say, we are the capital C, and you obey us, or we'll make life miserable for you. And whether you liked it or not, you would, chances are you're going to go along. But with people, choices now, across a lot of the world, you can make whatever religious choice you want to practice, and there isn't just one monolithic church. There are a lot of different sects even within that, and I think they realize now that the flock is dissipating, or it can latch on to some of these other ones that if the church took too strong of a stand against, then they would be alienating. But I really like the way you described that. That makes so much sense.
It's an interesting phenomenon, and actually even in doctrine itself, they've made some room, and they've made the language a little less exclusive, and they actually acknowledge that there is wisdom and salvation, not specifically outside of the church, but they've kind of given it some wiggle room, let's say, for people who, previously they kind of would say, well, these people are unsaved. I think there's some growth in their outlook on, a more universal sort of approach. And that's all good. I think that's all a positive thing. It's interesting though, because it comes, then it begins to look more like, the ancient version of Christianity, where we talked about earlier, there were multiple, hundreds of competing ideas and sects and, symbol systems and philosophies and so on that were at work. And I think that, that's actually very vibrant and very living and powerful when you have, systems of a living religion. When something becomes useless, when it's dead, when it's stagnated. And the whole idea of Christianity is a resurrection. It's a life, an eternal life after death. I mean, that's the big symbology in the religion. So for it not to have an element of growth and questioning and competing ideas, I think does it a great disservice. So anyway, getting back to Gnosticism really quickly, and then we'll kind of wrap this up and move on, because we're pretty far into this. I one thing I liked about this, and again, I obviously you're going to get the most out of listening to any of these podcasts by actually, reading the sections in the book, and then going and listening to us, or going back and reading the book after you hear our discussion. But this comes from page 55, and he's laying out some of the basic ideas of Gnosticism, which he calls the principles of Gnosticism. And these allegedly come from Simon Magus through Hippolytus. And he says, "To you, therefore, I say what I say, and write what I write, and the writing of this, of the universal eons, periods, planes, or cycles of creative and creative life in substance and space, celestial creatures." That's the word eon. It's kind of one of those words that has multiple meanings. "There are two shoots, without beginning or end, springing from one root, which is the power invisible, inapprehensible silence, otherwise known in Greek as bythos or bethos. Of these shoots, one is manifested from above, and is the great power, the universal mind, ordering all things, male and other, is manifested from below, the great thought, female, which produces or is producing all things. Hence, pairing with each other, they unite and manifest the middle distance, incomprehensible air without beginning or end. In this is the Father who sustains all things and nourishes those things which have a beginning and end." So there's that tension between and working through process between the absolute, the infinite, and then the created existence, plus that masculine and feminine symbolism. So it's really a beautiful, beautiful way of looking at that. And I think that's one of the interesting things too about the early Gnostic movements is the emphasis and equality of sort of the feminine principle, which Orthodox Christianity definitely stamped out until they finally started rallying around Mary and making that doctrine. Her bodily ascension became doctrine in the 1800s or something like that. Or no, it was the early 1900s, I believe. Sorry for that, but it was late. It was very late in the church's career, and so the Gnostics again were far ahead of the Orthodox Church in terms of some of their philosophy and wisdom, which is interesting.
Well, you could almost hear Taoism in the passage that you've read between, the absolute spirit, that undifferentiated potential that would be, heaven, as opposed to earth, and not only that these things are distinctly opposite, but it's the interplay between the two that's where the humankind, and that's crucible. That's where these things actually take place. Because if you have absolute spirit, well, it's just hanging around in the ether, and it's not really doing anything in the material world. And then if you have absolute substance or matter, attributed to feminine, mater, maternal matter.
Yeah.
It's very much through the etymology of the word, that if it's you just have substance, then you just have stuff, and it's not really doing anything. It's not really inspired or directed towards some kind of purpose. And it's where these two interplay, the masculine and the feminine, the spirit and the matter. That's the point of contact, and that's where we are.
Yeah.
We're spirits in this material body. We are of both worlds in a way.
Yeah.
Really belonging 100% to neither, but it's this connection as above, so below, and then the midpoint where we get our activity. And this is where, through our mundane, our material everyday life, if that's imbued with this spirit, well, then that's going to be it's faith and works. Faith without works is dead.
Yeah.
That's from Scripture too. It's really having that dynamic combination.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because what my mind went to as you were talking about that was the Catholic Church and all of the early arguments about Jesus and who he was and what he was, and they ended up coming up with the formulation that he's fully human and fully God at the same time. And that's where that I'm thinking about the matter, and I'm thinking about the spirit uniting in the one person, and those two principles that fully united and in complete balance, and represented by that masculine and feminine, represented by the heaven and earth. So it's interesting, because they did key into that eventually, and they did emphasize that his dual nature as fully human and fully divine at the same time, which was a stroke of brilliance, really. And I think it was connected to that archetypal wisdom. So that's the thing with the church is, people are oftentimes down on it. Sometimes we get frustrated with the narrowness of the orthodoxy and the dogma and so forth. But if you really look and you dig into it, you can find all of this ancient, particularly in the Catholic Church and, in the Byzantine Church and some of the more orthodox versions of the older, continuously operating churches, and their symbolic writings and so on. So that's an interesting thing. So, all right, so moving on, we're going to get into the mysteries of Serapis. The title of this particular portion is called The Mysteries of Asar-Hapi, or Asar-Hapi, which is Serapis in Egyptian. You were bringing up an interesting point earlier about Serapis. Please elucidate.
Well, Hall points out that one of the important factors of Serapis is that both the Greeks and the Egyptians, even though maybe they had a little different name, they really venerated this figure, who, like we're talking about Gnosticism being, spirit and matter, that dynamic. Serapis also has the masculine and feminine qualities, perhaps androgynous, in the figure of the God person, him or herself, thus self. And it, the name, I guess, etymologically, we can trace it to, Apis, the bull, Serapis. And then also, maybe the death of the bull, or the transformation of the bull, perhaps going back to Indo Brahmin origin or influence. And it really shows
Indo-European.
Yeah, and it shows how at that time especially, and by that time, I'm talking maybe several hundred years, in that pre-Christian and then early Christian era, there were so many schools and traditions, and it was comparative religion when these things were even forming, that there were so many influences. In a modern viewpoint, we tend to think, well, these are all separate things. And as a comparative mythologist or someone interested in comparative religion, it's our job to then find, this is similar to that, this is similar to that. Whereas perhaps originally, when these things were being formed, there was already a sort of sea of this mixture of cultures, and especially in the Near East, that would have come together, through trade routes and everything else that were already established. So there's an exchange of ideas. So they even arose in an environment of different traditions and different religions. They didn't come out in a vacuum, so that there were so many different ideas and competing versions and altering the dogma, maybe every decade or so there was some update or change. Just shows really that it was such a rich dynamic period then.
And even people were very sophisticated. I think that we tend to think that the ancient mind was somehow dull or not very sophisticated. Because people had less technology does not mean they were less intelligent. They put their efforts towards different things, and they were probably much more attuned to philosophy and religion and things of the spirit than we will ever be again with our reliance on technology. So, they actually were quite cosmopolitan. People traveled. There was a lot of interplay between different cultures. People spoke multiple languages. There was trade, Roman goods and Persian goods and ancient Chinese goods are found in Rome and in China and in Persia. There was clearly interconnections between all of these things, and I think that has to be remembered when we look at these religions and we think about where we are today. It's important to remember that they were actually quite sophisticated. And what I think, one of the things I think that's important in looking at this book in general, The Secret Teachings, is that Manly Hall has a very beautiful way of describing all these different things, explaining all these different things, bringing all these different things one after another up. And it sometimes seems like it's like you kind of wonder where you are in time. And I think he did that on purpose. I think he did that to show the universal nature of these ideas, and that the interplay between all of these different cultures and faiths, so that we as modern people could wrap our heads around the idea that, it's not a linear progression. And also time is somewhat irrelevant in all of this, because there are universal and eternal principles at work underneath all of these symbols, underneath all of these competing philosophies and religions. And I really think that's one of the ideas that he's driving at all throughout the Secret Teachings. Would you agree with me on that?
Well, I would, and such a good point about time, this linear progression of time, that, this started and then somebody else came and it became this, and it progressed and built and evolved. I guess that's the fallout from, the Darwin philosophy, that it can start here, and then there was a logical, progressive track but it wasn't like that then. I think a lot of stuff was just this, cloud of, or a world of interesting, and they were coming together in the Near East. And but in our modern, current, contemporary viewpoint, we can easily trace the evolution of, say, like the automobile or the airplane, for instance, in the last 100+ years. The airplane has gone from a dream to this, stick and canvas and a teeny little engine, and it went 200 feet, kind of, daredevil contraption, to a practical form of travel and delivering goods, then a war machine. And, now you just get on an airplane and go to France. So you don't think anything of it. But you can see the progression: teeny little engine, little stick and wire plane, and then now it's made out of metal, and now it has a jet engine, and now it goes faster. But that's one way of looking at things and the way they evolve. I don't know if that model have that in our consciousness, because we're so used to the 20th century being such a progression of
technology. It's such a linear, rational and logical sort of development, and it is we favor the thinking mind over any other ways of perceiving information any longer too. So that, I think that we sort of look back in hindsight and think that other people did that also, or these cultures or those cultures did this or that. So we try to parse out this information in a logical and technical way. And it's not that simple. I think that history, especially the history of ideas, is more of a series of interconnections and spirals than it is any kind of line.
I like that, spirals, yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
It keeps coming around again. And each time it does, maybe then there's a new level or
new iteration,
frequency or something.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, a little more circular than linear. And I think that's just a problem with modernity. We take some of these things that are very familiar to us and do fit in those contexts, but they really don't apply that way to things, like you said, about ideas and beliefs. And
exactly.
It's a lot more dynamic, a lot more going on.
Speaking of, getting back to, before we go too much further, Serapis is a mysterious figure. And I think it was an interesting thing where you spoke about, I don't remember if you spoke about this on the show or if it was when we were speaking before, but how you were saying that it brought together Greek, Roman, and Egyptian influences into one figure. And it really, the figure of Serapis then becomes symbolic of that sort of rich mix of culture known as Greco-Roman or Greco-Egyptian religion and culture. And I think he became then a figure for that whole sort of zeitgeist, that whole cultural milieu, as you might say. And in that sense, then Serapis was a very important a deity in that region. And we don't know much about him/her, because and I say that because, as you spoke earlier, there's a masculine and feminine element to Serapis, and a sort of a balance there, which is very interesting. I would encourage the listener to read all of these sections and to read, the entire book. But if you're gonna, in particular, if you're interested in this section, it begins on around page 58. It looks like 58 in the little version of the book.
Well, so Serapis plays Well, this Serapis figure plays really a central role, or at least shows up in a central way with what we were talking about, that there were an exchange of a multitude of ideas and beliefs that was free and open, especially in Alexandria, where the famous library and all the schools and the courtyards where you could exchange these ideas and visit people from many nations that would all come there. There was the Serapeum, the statue of Serapis was there, perhaps serving as a patron, in that idea that these different cultures, in this case, the Greek and Egyptian, can come together in this place, through this one figure. And it was perhaps even because of this that later on, in the process by which the Library of Alexandria was destroyed, one of the things they really wanted to destroy first was this statue of Serapis.
Yeah.
That was almost central to the maybe this idea of having different cultures coexist, overlap, work together.
Well, it seems like
needed to be broken down.
Exactly, and it seems like the early Orthodox Church was trying to set itself over and against all of these different, what it considered competing philosophies. And so in a sense, I think, as we were talking about earlier, you brought up, Christianity went from being persecuted to being a state religion, and then, in effect, starting to persecute the very people that persecuted it 100 or 200 years before. So it turned from persecuted to persecutor quite quickly. And, it's unfortunate, because that's not in line with the message of Jesus in any way. and we all know that. But it's interesting then that they would try to destroy a symbol of syncretic faith. In essence, it's like, okay, here's these different ideas, and they seem to be competing, but in essence, there's really a substantial interconnected nature to them. And I think that that was an interesting thing that took place at that time.
And one of the symbols that is mentioned, and I think there's even a pictorial description of the maze, the bull, the minotaur with the man upper body and a bull lower body. Again, the apis, part of Serapis, meaning bull, and this labyrinth that is associated with the minotaur, that this maze of the world of earthly things, that we humans are in this maze trying to find our way out, trying to find our way through towards something better, a higher level of consciousness, and that we're all in some ways searching and seeking to find the right doorway to this larger existence. But that the labyrinth, and labyrinth has been in so many cultures. Native Americans have labyrinths, Hindus, everything. So again, here's a symbol that shared by so many cultures, that many of them probably did have contact. We talk about the trade routes, how different cultures could be connected, but probably didn't have a lot of contact with the natives of the Americas back then, at least that we know of.
Yeah, no.
But again, this similar thing of wandering in this earth plane, and not just wandering, specifically seeking, a way through, a way out. So again, with Serapis.
Well, and I think when we... Oh, go ahead. I'm
sorry. Oh, yeah. Well, this, again, it seems to be reiterated again with this symbolism.
Yeah, good point. And kind of getting to the bottom of this again and circling back around, but I think one of the important things to try to remember, and this is a challenge in this day and age when we've become so polarized, especially in this country, this versus that, Democrat versus Republican, all of our different sort of divisions that we've set up within ourselves and between ourselves. And when we go beyond that, we can see the universal and the archetypal. And what we mean by that is really the truth of what it means to be a human being living in a body on the earth, and the spiritual behind that, and in and through all of our experience. And then the universal messages, which are the things that are common to all human beings, the experiences that they have. Cultures, yes, are different, localized versions of cultures and different ideas, and they're all valuable and important. But when you sort of look at it and you become a student of comparative religion and mythology, you begin to see these same symbols play themselves out over and over again in different cultures. And, in the last years in the academic world, that has been looked at as being somewhat of a Western viewpoint, or a patriarchal, European viewpoint that's been foisted on these other people. But at second investigation over the years, as they have more and more good evidence to support the fact that these people that have these different ideas, there's more communication than ever before, obviously, with the internet and so on, and better translations of texts and more communication between different cultures. But they're finding, again, the same things, universal messages. And people on both sides, both the European mentality, the academic mentality, and the more localized cultural versions of those truths, are communicating, and they're both agreeing with each other. And I think that that's an important thing to remember, that as human beings, we have more in common than we do less in common. We've got more things that connect us together than drive us apart. And we have to constantly remind ourselves of that, because different languages, different music, different media, different foods, all of this stuff serves to, make us think that our position is superior or is the truth, whereas that one over there is a lie and needs to be stamped out, or whatever it is. But the reality is it's just different ways of interacting with the sort of experiences we have on this planet.
Well, I think that underscores maybe a significant difference between the modern mind and perhaps the ancient mind. The ancient mind could see through, even though the symbols and the surface nature of these ideas appeared very different, they could really see through that and see the essence behind it. Whereas if a native in the American Southwest might worship, an eagle or some sort of bird, well, maybe a native tradition more in the north, like in Seattle area, might worship, a fish or an orca or something like that doesn't exist, but it's just a localized version of another animal spirit.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think an ancient mind could see the essence underneath it, either in the person or in their particular set of symbols and traditions. They could see that, well, you worship God too. Well, you call it something else, and he's a bird, and he's not a goat that we worship. Yeah. But they could tell that they kind of wanted or were looking at the same thing. And the differences were interesting and were noted, but they weren't a threat to either one's own way of looking at things, or that somehow it bled all the way down to the essential doctrine that these are actually fundamentally different things. We do see that now. We say, oh, well, this person worships this God and this one worships that God. And boy, are they different. And they're going to go to war.
Well, I think we get caught up in the surface view of things, the
we've lost
objective,
that
quote
essence.
Unquote view. We've lost the essence.
Everybody.
You're right. And that's the, what I think might be called the mythological worldview, where you can actually, those symbols are living things for you. You don't get caught up in the actual literal thing itself. Like, and you were talking about, a bird or an orca, or, we speak about raven or these different symbols that are used for these divine powers. I think that the ancient mind, much less than we, was able to see through even the symbol to the essence behind it to a much more efficient and powerful degree. And so, I think that and even people today that we would consider, I don't want to use the word primitive, but more simple, less technologically oriented, tend to still live with a more mythological worldview. And I don't use that term pejoratively. I actually live in that view myself. And it is a view of life that has more meaning, and you see the truth beyond the facts, and you delve into the literal and go beyond the literal to the symbolic, and that's where the truth really lives, I believe. So I think that that's maybe the difference between a scientific worldview and maybe a more mythological or spiritual worldview. They're not necessarily in conflict, but they can clash if one side thinks it's the right view and the other side is wrong. But they're really just two ways of interacting with the world, much like, science and religion are two different ways of viewing things. And different, they're different tools. They're different ways of seeing. So with that being said, we actually are kind of running up against the time. So we didn't really have time to get to the Odinic Mysteries, but I would highly encourage the listener to read this section, and read particularly the Odinic Mysteries section. It's very cool and very interesting.
And it also, like you said, this is just a very cursory overview. It gets much more time and space treatment later on in the Secret Teachings, where I think in 2 more chapters, it really focuses on that. And just on that point, the reason in these first 3 chapters to give these brief overviews, it's really setting the stage for this book, The Secret Teachings. Not going into too much detail on specific rites or rituals and symbols of this, like he gets into more detail later. But at this point, it's really kind of the origin and how these things developed in our culture. That seems to be what he's getting at with these several different, the Gnostics and Odinic that we've talked about these last couple times.
Yeah.
It's more contextualizing them and, setting up their early origin, not so much, these are the 9 steps to this. It touches on it, but that's not the focus.
Does,
the focus is to,
no, you're right,
to show that these were
set it up,
coming out of this soup of ideas, and how they were influenced by and influenced each other, or separated themselves from each other as they were developing.
Yeah.
So this is really setting up the development of Western spiritual and symbolic thought. Great point.
And so, that being said, we'll wrap it up now, but I'm excited to get to next week's and to go deeper into these individual sections as well. So, we are touching on briefly some of these things and maybe even skipping over some of them in these first chapters, but only because we're going to delve into them in a much deeper way. Thank you for bringing that up. So next week we'll do part 3 of this section, and that'll be available soon. Thank you for listening to Cosmic Eye. We always appreciate your listening and your support. And, please check out chrissheridan.com or cosmiceye.org for more information about either Chris or I. I'm, again, Jason Napolitano, and my co-host is Chris Sheridan. And we are happy to be speaking about spiritual things each week. We have a new episode up every Saturday night or Sunday morning, depending. Generally speaking, it's Saturday night. But by Sunday, you'll get a new episode. So thank you again for listening. Have a great week, and join us again on the Cosmic Eye. Goodbye, and God bless.
Thank you for listening, and please join us next Sunday for a new episode of Cosmic Eye. You can purchase If You Can Worry, You Can Meditate at Amazon.com or through our website, cosmiceye.org.